Tonight, for the access-specific user group, Kent Gorrell is going to present an approach to using the temporal tables in SQL Server to audit data changes. But before we start, there are a couple of things I wanted to talk about. First of all, we have some upcoming, if you're not already aware of it, Carl Donabauer's Access DevCon is coming up in a couple of weeks, but I'm sure he will accept last minute registrations if you would like to go. On our Access User Group meeting schedule, we have the calendar for all of the Access User Groups, including this one. And my announcement, which just hit my iPhone 3 or 4 minutes ago, is that we are launching a Latin America chapter starting April 25th. Edgar Olivares will be the chapter president for Latin America, and his first presentation will be manipulating JSON. So welcome aboard, Edgar. I'm looking forward to participating in that group. I've seen Edgar participating at Access World, and he's a real sharp developer, so we're looking forward to that. And the other group that I wanted to mention is the San Francisco Access User Group. It's very informal. Crystal and I usually attend. It's just a group of guys who get together and talk. Sometimes they have a question or a problem to discuss, but it's more of an informal gab session, I would say, for Access developers. So those are the upcoming things. Now back to Kent. I appreciate Kent stepping in. I had a couple of bumps in scheduling, and Kent agreed to do this on kind of a last minute notice. And as a result, he did not have a lot of time to prepare. And I appreciate him stepping in anyway. So I will stop my share, let Kent share and take it away. And the other thing I was going to mention before I turn over is I had occasion this week to wish we had this presentation already. I was fooling around trying to put together a little video, and I had made a change in an application, and I was adding and deleting records to test the change. And I deleted a record, and I thought, I'll remember what I just deleted and put it back after the test. Well, of course, I got interrupted, and 5 minutes later, I couldn't remember what I had deleted. And so I had to make a best guess. And I was really regretting not having a SQL Server audit table in place to save me from that little faux pas. Wasn't a serious problem, but it just brought home the importance of having audit. With that, Kent, the floor is yours. Please start sharing.
Okay.
And away we are. We're seeing you.
Okay. Well, that's a good start. All right, boys and girls. I'm going to start off by having a look at the end result and what we can do with it after giving you a very brief overview of the data structure. And we'll have a look at what we can finally get out of this, and then I'll go back and show you the steps to actually get here. So what we're looking at right now is a stored procedure. And let's just get rid of all that stuff up the top because I'm not really going to use that. So this is a query that allows us to view data from a particular point in time. So this is our go back machine. Now, this query is based on a view, which we'll just look at here. And this view gets data from our class table, our student table, and our grades table. So we've got the grade table has a result, like a grade score for each student who is in that class. So we can actually see what we've got there. If we go like this, that is our current data. Right, so if we go back to our stored procedure and have a look. And let's set the date to be now. Oh, I don't need to do that. I can just go, and that gives us the same result. Now, if we go back a couple of days, that's where we were 2 days ago. Where we were, say, 6 days ago. So you're seeing changes to people's names. You're seeing changes to the classes that have been performed, and you're seeing any changes to their grade score. So going back in time is simply a matter of inquiring of this view using the as of that date. That's pretty special, I reckon. Anyhow, let's have a look at how we get there. Obviously, we're getting stuff from this view, which is built on these 3 tables we can say over the left: class, grade, student. And I kind of stole these tables out of VentureWorks, but then I fixed them up because their naming conventions were all over the shop. And you all know how I feel about naming conventions. And if we look at the class table, you can see here I've already got a temporal table on it, but I also have another table called class audit. And this is how we previously would have done things, where we've got a class audit table, which has the same fields as the table it's auditing, except that it has its own primary key. It then has the class ID, which is the primary key in the parent table, and the other records from the parent table. The other columns from the parent table. Now, in the trigger, we're inserting and from the class table into this audit table. Now, there's a couple of decisions you can make here. If we look up the top, for a trigger, we've got a after, insert, update, and delete. Now, when you're dealing with a trigger, there are 2 kind of hidden tables in the background. One is called deleted, the other is called inserted. So the deleted table has all the records before the insert, update, or delete. In the case of insert, there won't be anything in the deleted table because there was nothing there then. There will be stuff in the inserted table. And if you're deleting a record, there'll be stuff in the deleted table, but there'll be nothing in the inserted. And if you're doing an update, there'll be stuff inserted and also in deleted. And so you can decide whether or not you want to capture the data before the change was made or after the change was made. Now, when we start using temporal tables, the decision's already made for you. It's going to be capturing the data before the change was made. Now, if we look at the data in our base table, we've got a class name, the person who created it, the edit date, that sort of thing. If we now look in the temporal table, select the top 1,000 rows, and of course, these are all going to be read-only. We can see all the changes that were made and when they were made. Now, there are a couple of particular tables, the period from and the period date to. Now, you can use different names, but that gives the period as to when this particular record was valid. Now, in here, you won't find the current record, but you'll find all the previous ones since the time you turned on temporal tables. So how do we turn on temporal tables? So the first thing we need to do is have a table. Now, you can create the temporal table at the same time as you create the table, but let's just assume that we actually have a table that already exists. So we need to add these 2 special columns. So for our well, that'll actually be table in this particular database, because I'll use TBL and I always use singular. And we've got a date from and a date to. Now, they're going to need a default value. And the other option we have here is whether or not we're going to hide these columns. So when we opened this column, we can't see those columns, even though they're there, because we created those columns, but we said we want to hide them. Because for general usage, like when you're using forms and what have you, you really just want to ignore that those columns exist, because they're only really going to be used in the temporal table, and you don't want to have to play around with them in forms. Now, when you're creating a report that shows you the previous data and any changes, right, you will be interested in the period from and the period date. And we'll talk about how you would actually present this data a little bit later. So having created first those two special columns that have got our period range, we then use this syntax to say, all right, period for system time, period date, period, and then we actually turn on the temporal table with syntax like that. We can also turn off a temporal table, and we'll have a think about why we want to do that in a minute. So that's pretty much all there is to creating your temporal table. So we're adding two columns, and we're setting the period for system time, and then we're turning on the history table, and we can allow SQL Server to create the table name for our history table, but I like to have something that actually is meaningful and I can get at it nicely. Now, when you've created a temporal table on a table like such, you now have no option for altering the table. Even if you want to alter with TSQL, it won't give you the script. However, you can make changes to the data structure of your table that has a temporal table attached to it using TSQL. And because I usually manage my table structures through the front end of my application, I use TSQL. And it wasn't until Tom Van Stepper pointed out to me the other day that you can't actually make design changes once you've made a temporal table, but I realized you couldn't. But you can actually make changes using TSQL. The joy that comes with that is that if you make a change to the primary table using TSQL, for example, you add a column, that column is automatically added to the class temporal table, or is automatically added to the temporal table as well. So you don't have to think about managing the temporal table, as opposed to if you're using triggers, where you would have to then modify your trigger to include that additional column and deal with it. So nice thing about using a temporal table is that you can make changes to the table and it automatically applies to the temporal table. The downside is that you can't make design changes in Management Studio, at least in the current version of Management Studio that I've got. I would imagine that they will add that ability at some point in the future. So that's kind of an overview. Does anyone have any questions at this point? What was the next thing I was going to...
Hang on just a second. The only question that I have is that when you create a new column, I assume it's just null values in any existing record for that column.
Okay, in SQL Server, when you add a column, you can add a default for that column, and TSQL has an option that allows you to apply that default value to any existing records. Unlike in Access, where you have to create the column, then
an
run a
update
query
or
to
something.
update the
Okay.
value where it's null in the previously existing records, and then you can apply a not null. In SQL Server, you can do the whole lot in one hit. You give it a default value, you tell it not null, and away it goes. Because, for example, if you're adding a bit column in SQL Server, as we know, bits can't be null because they're either a 1 or a 0. But you can give it a default of either 1 or 0, and that will apply to any existing records, which is kind of nice. So say we actually really, really, really want to make a change to our grade table through Management Studio. Well, it's possible, and the way we would do that is set versioning off. We can then now, theoretically, oh, okay, got to refresh, Kent. Okay, so see, now you can actually come in here and make changes now. If you do that, however, you need to make the same change in the temporal table, and you need to do that manually. So that's the only proviso on that. Let's add a And if we don't remember to add it in the temporal table as well, then all hell will break loose.
Like you won't be
Now,
able to turn it back on again.
with our temporal table, we don't need the constraints. So, and as with audit tables, you don't need default constraints because you're just getting the data from the primary table, which has got default constraints and things like that. So with audit tables, you don't need all those constraints. In fact, you don't need a whole lot of indexes. The only index you really need is on the column that's the primary key in the primary table. If we, okay, I forgot to allow null. It's not letting me do it anyhow. So if I want to set that back on, as John alluded to, we will get a message to say that our columns don't match. So just for the sake of the argument, let's remove that column. Now set our versioning back on. And if we come up here and we hit F5 to refresh, we'll see we've now got auditing on our grade table again. So that's kind of the highlights. That's only taken me 25 minutes. Let's go back to here again, where we're pulling this stuff out of our view, which is getting the stuff out of there, and we've got the as of in the where clause, which is what makes this the special source. And of course, you can just put a date there if you want. Right, and that'll give you where you were at that particular point in time. Right. So it's easy as that to get a snapshot from the past. Of course, using a view that gives you the data from 3 different tables that each have the system version turned on is the key to making that work. So the as of is being applied to all of those tables, all 3 of those tables, all at once.
So 3 questions.
Yep.
This is built into SQL Server, right? This is SQL Server stuff.
Since 2016.
That was my next question. As of 2016. Good. Okay, so then, and my final question is the SQL language itself changed to include this stuff? Is there an alteration to SQL language spec to include all this stuff, or is this a SQL Server only kind of thing?
Is it ANSI compliant? I don't know.
Yes. Is there like a as of 2010 version or something like that?
Well, I haven't tried applying it to Postgres. I would imagine that it wouldn't be totally compliant, or even if I would imagine Postgres has something like this, but
I may be wrong, but I think I remember reading something this morning or this afternoon rather, that it was in the ANSI spec for a while before SQL Server adopted it.
Oh, okay. Good.
But we all know not to trust my memory.
Or mine.
must be true. I read it on the internet.
Well, we used to remember that, George.
What else was interesting about this? So yes, if you're making changes to your data structures using TSQL, you don't even have to think about the audit table. Now, the next question is, how would we present this data in an Access form? Now, I would have liked to have had time to show this. Tom Van Studer mentioned that there are a couple of functions that you can use with this. One being a function that gives you the previous value and one that gives you the next value. But for my purposes, what I would want to do is put a subform in my form that has a report, not a form as such, because you can put a report in a subform control. And of course, with reports, you can hide previous values if they're the same, or repeating values if they're the same, which you can't do with forms. So to put the data from, say, this data into a report in a subform control, so you can see all the values for a particular history. What have I got? What would be a...
So you're actually looking at changes in values in records over time, line after line.
Yeah. So you've got you can have a look at from the temporal table. So imagine you are in a form that's showing your classes. And so the subform is master child. That always throws me. For some things it's parent child, but for subforms for some unknown reason it's master and child. So you'd have this, which would give you your history of the changes that were made, and obviously it'd be sorted on the period from date or whatever, and that's in your subform. And therefore, in a report, you could hide any values that were the same as the previous record. And I think that would work quite well. You may find that to make it even better, you could have a union query that gave you the current record as well as the temporal records. So you've got both the current and all the rest, and you can hide changes to the individual rows. Or sorry, hide changes, hide values that haven't changed from the previous record. So that's kind of how I would do it using a report in a subform control. Obviously, you could just run a report. So that's really all there is to it. It's not that hard to implement.
No, it's amazingly easy to implement.
Which is why I was a bit, when I'm dumbstruck when I came across it, went, oh,
Yeah.
well, there's a simple answer to something I thought was going to be a hell of a lot of work, creating a whole lot of triggers and stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, I could write code that would just, and in fact, I already have. I've written code that takes the data structure for the primary table and changes that primary key into just a non-unique index and adds an additional primary key, but otherwise the columns are all the same, except you've dropped all the constraints and all of the indexes. So, I've written code that will do it, whereas this is just easy.
Yeah.
And then you've got to write code that will maintain your triggers. So if your trigger changes, you've then got to modify your triggers. So that was seeming to me like an awful lot of work. But going back to the point about the triggers, with the triggers, you've got the option to include the current record in the audit table because you've got the option to say, okay, give me the stuff from the inserted record, whereas here you're just getting from the deleted values that go into here, which is why I'm saying that if you have a report, you might want to actually use a union query that gives you the current record as well as the records from the temporal table to do a full comparison.
Do you have to do anything special to recover, or is it just a matter of an update query against your temporal table if you decide you need to recover one of those values?
Well, if you want to recover, right, then you can use the as of to recover from a particular date, or you can just use the previous record, which I'll think of the name of the function in a minute. Only downside of not having the current function in the temporal is if you get a corruption to your current record. Well, the previous should have gotten written to here anyway, but when was the last time anyone had a corruption in a record in SQL Server? I see them in Access quite often, but not so much in SQL. And it would be interesting to see if there was a corruption in the record, whether a copy of it before it changed was written into the temporal table. So here we can just so we can update our current record from the most recent record from the temporal table back into the primary table if we need to do a recovery to any particular point in time. So we can either just get the last record or we can get from a particular time where we know that before Adrian changed his name to Edmondson, we got it from there.
So I'm assuming there's no rollback type syntax where you could say roll back record X to this date or something like that.
Well, it's possible there is, and I just haven't come across it yet. But to just write a query that updates your current record from that point in the past isn't that big a deal. But yeah, you'd think maybe somebody might have written a system stored procedure to actually do that.
You're right, Kent. It would be very straightforward to take any individual record back to a particular point in time. You've got the data, you just update it to that data. Doing it to the whole lot might a rollback, as I think John was talking about, might be make more sense if it were for the whole table. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So you could say, look, here's a date in time. I want the system to be back as it was at that point. Can you, handle all of the updates for me? Because there'll be multiple ones. And that's the sort of thing that would be a really handy thing to have. But to do it for an individual record would be trivial, I think, is appropriate.
Yep. So you can do individuals, or you could do the whole lot, but really the main purpose is to be able to give you this snapshot of what your data was at a particular time and date. But yeah, using the as of, you could roll back everything to what it was at that
Well, you
date and
could.
time. But
That's not the same as rolling it back, but it
Mm.
then it occurs to me that most of the SQL Server has got backups. So you could do a restore to a particular time if you had a backup for that time.
Exactly. SQL restore from a backup can give you to a very specific time as you need, rather than rewriting a code to pull this temporal data back to every single table.
Yeah, but Brian, as I said that, it occurred to me that you've only then got what you've got in the way of the. Oh no, you haven't, because it
It's an
does.
entire database backup. You've got the whole lot, and all the transaction logs. If you're backing up your transaction log, you've got a complete. You can roll back to any point in time.
The transaction log gives you any sort of time that you could specify within the time that the transaction log was active. So yeah, that would work too.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So this is just tracking changes for you over time, rather than being a backup system. I think the SQL backup is far preferable for restoring from a folder.
Yeah, because there are methods that do actually use the SQL Server log files to give you this data back. So, typically, there are a few different ways you can do your audit logs. I haven't played with the tracking changes, but there are methods that actually do use the log files to put your stuff back. So when you initiate the versioning, it's using the log files that are already there. So it's not unlike this, which starts creating records when you turn logging on. Other methods will actually use the existing log files to give you all that data.
I would say that what this gives you that the log file doesn't. This came to light because John asked about, well, what about rolling back? The log file is, it seems to me, clearly a better way to roll back if that's what you want. But what this gives you is the ability to compare while you still have the current data, to compare and contrast with not only other data from a specific time, but from multiple data from multiple other times if you want to. So it gives you that full view of history without actually having to do a rollback, without losing what you've currently got.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah,
This is actually brilliant for what.
Yeah.
For what
When Kent mentioned it, audit logs, I went back to a financial systems application that I worked on many years ago, where the accuracy of the audit trail was paramount to making sure that they were not being robbed. So I'm thinking this is a great way to simplify that. As a transaction has occurred, is created, if somebody comes later and modifies it, they change $100 to $1,000, there's a track of when that happened.
So the ability, and for my purposes, being able to get what the budget was at a particular date, as opposed to what the budget was at a different date, as opposed to what the budget now, just by using a view and putting a as of filter on it, is just joyous.
Here's a question for you, Ken, just to clarify. You talk about as of. When I look at that, I see that as a for system time as of, as in they all need to be there, because you're not specifying for system time unless you're saying as of a particular day. So I see all of that, those four blue words, if you like, as one constant thing that you have to add. You had to add all or none. Would that be right? Or have I missed something?
Well, that's a good point, because when you're creating it, you're saying period for system time, and you've got that date range.
And
so
when
each table has got that, right? So period time for system time. Now, I don't know what other options you've got there, but you will notice that they're all using date time too, generated as of convert. All right, so default here, system UTC date time. And SQL Server has a couple of different ways of giving you the current date.
Yeah.
One being get date, and the other being some timestamp, which is actually ANSI compatible. What's that? Select current timestamp.
Ah.
Right. Now, and current timestamp is actually ANSI compatible, whereas
But it's not UTC. Because it's
no.
your time and not mine.
Well, I only care about my time. I don't care about yours. Yours is the middle of the night, isn't it?
Yeah, but the point there is that when you're talking to America or you're talking to the Far East, unless it's based on UTC, and George commented earlier that it probably was based on UTC, unless it's based on UTC, there's going to be problems when you try and do work across date lines, not time zones. Whereas if it's UTC, whatever it displays locally, if it's stored UTC, then there are no such issues.
Yeah, and I've come across this just recently with a project I'm working on, and I've got one guy who's actually working from Malaysia, so his time is a bit out. So, and I've got to figure out exactly how to deal with that if he's making changes. So when we look at the change he made and the change somebody else made, if the date's being stamped in the front end rather than on the server, then who actually made the change first, given that he's 4 hours behind?
That's why you should always use UTC and then adjust to display.
Yeah. Yep. It's a good point.
And I didn't notice really, is there a column for the date time that the change was made, whatever the change was?
Oh, well, yes. So you've got
Table.
these two columns, which I've hidden in the main column, but when you look at the data in the temporal table, you've got the period that record was valid for. So the next record would be valid from here to whatever the next time is. So in the current record, in the primary table, that date time table, so you've got the date and time in that column.
So the period from is actually the date time that the change was saved back into the database.
Yes, in the temporal table, the period to date is the date and time the record was last saved in the main table. So the record that was just saved had been current since this, but when it was saved, that's the date it was actually saved.
Is that going to happen if a save does not actually change any values?
Well,
does that make sense?
Yeah. How do you save if there's no change to the values? You don't.
You don't.
Well, you could delete a record, I suppose.
Yeah.
I mean, that's changing
That's
all
a
the values.
change, but yeah.
Well, if the record's not dirty, it's not going to save, is it?
Yeah. I guess that question doesn't really make any sense now that I think about it.
So if we look in here, right, we're not seeing those columns, but they are there. And the equivalent period from date would be that, and the period to date would be pretty much meaningless in this table because it's going to become from that to that. So this is, the date range that record was valid from. And in here, the period from date will be the same as this period to date in the temporal table. And then when you save the record, that period to date goes back to the period start date here. And that's the way it goes.
Brent, I'm a little bit confused here, if I'm honest, because it talks about period from and period to. Now, I would expect each time each time a record is logged, so a change is logged, you put the new version in and you stamp it with the date and time of when you do that. At the point you do that, it doesn't know how long it's going to be valid for. It only knows it's valid until the next change comes along, and then a new record has that new date and time stamped on it. Why is
that was what I was trying to explain, but not doing it terribly well.
Hang on, Ken. Let me ask my question, if I may. I've just outlined a little bit of confusion. So what I'm saying is, my question is, what does a period to date mean when the next time a change is made, it creates a new record and puts that? Why does it need to update the old record there at all? That's what I'm trying to say.
Well,
I don't think it updates the old record. I think it grabs the period to from the old record and puts it in the period from in the new record.
And how would that make sense, John?
So the period to date in the primary table doesn't know what it is yet. But the period from date...
That's the point. It would never know what it is until you get to the next thing. And John said you would load it from the previous record. It wouldn't be in the previous record. Couldn't possibly know when it last saved it what would be the next time it saved it. So it's only when you save it again that you have that period to date, as far as I understand.
Right, yeah.
So why would you then save it to the period to as well as the period from for the next record? What's the point of having it in there?
You don't. That period to date is filled in when you actually save the record, and then that transfers to the period start date.
But it would be of the previous record. The period to date of the previous record would be updated with the date time when you save the current record, right?
So when you do the next change, but why?
But isn't this temporal table only records that have been changed? So by default, they're going to be changed records with a change date.
But
so they don't have the current record in them. But
the current record will never know what the current record will never know what the period to is. I mean, it'll be now.
Yeah,
at any point in time, but it won't be recorded as now.
But is that even relevant? Because it's not in. I mean, the current value is not in the temporal table yet until something comes along to make it the changed value that then is inserted. Am I analyzing that wrong?
No, I think you might have hit on something there, George. Kent, do me a favor. Were you able to go back to that data with the period? There we go. That one. That's great. So if we look at that, then the first two period to dates end in 134, and the second and third period from date end in 134. So I infer that to mean, and they're all one down. So when we talk about referential integrity, is that no, not referent? We're talking about normalization of data. This is basically duplicating that information, which is why I thought this looks weird. Why would it do that? But that seems to be what it's doing. It's basically saying the period to date of one record is going to match the period from date of the next.
That's what I'm thinking.
Easier to query.
If the next time that same record.
Okay, so see that,
and John was right,
and that are the same. So effectively, that record lasted for a very short period of time, so short that it didn't register. So that period ended there. That record's life ended there, and the next one starts here. And this one was going till there, and then the next one starts from there. So you'll see that the start date is the same as the previous record's end date.
Yeah.
But John said
and-
something earlier, which was absolutely correct, but I didn't understand why it made sense until George said something, which is that the existing record in the actual live data isn't in here. Only the data that has been lost from live is in here. And it then goes back to the previous record, if there is one, to get when that previous data was live from.
Yeah, which is why I'm saying that if you want a report that gives you the full history, including the current record, you'd need to use a union query to get the current record as
to get
well
the current
as
record,
yes.
right?
Yeah, there
Well,
you
all
go.
the
indeed, but
records
that's
from
not
the
relevant to what
temporal.
we're talking about here. I mean, that's true, and it makes good sense, but that's the point
Yeah.
George just highlighted, which made what John said A, correct, and B, helped it make sense to me.
Well, if you look at the script that creates this, you'll see that the default value, right, on the period to date is set.
Now, probably.
No, it's set to that.
That's the default, yeah.
All right. So in the latest record in the primary table, the from date will be the date that the previous record was saved, and the to date will be that.
I don't believe that's correct, Kent.
But that's in the current. That's in the current record in the
That's
parent
correct.
table, not in the temporal table.
Because this record, the period to date in the current record is irrelevant because you haven't saved the record yet. So it's in perpetuity, which is that value, until you actually save the record, in which case, we then have a date that goes in there, but the current record, the period to date doesn't mean anything. It just means it's just there.
I thought the period to date was only included in the temporal table. Am I wrong?
No, it's in the primary table. It's just hidden, but it's meaningless.
Oh, so it was your choice to create a period to date as well as having a period from date, which gives you the same information.
No, you have to have it. It's just that I use the hidden keyword here, hidden option, so you don't actually see it in the primary table. So you can choose to actually see it if you want, but it's not going to mean anything. It's just going to have that date in it, which means, till the end of time.
So is period to_date something that is automatically added for you in the temporal table, or is it something you've created?
Well, when you add these two columns to the primary table, and then you run this code that creates system versioning, the temporal table will get all the columns, including these two, from the primary table.
So the two columns that we're talking about here, period from and period to date, they are required in order for system versioning to work.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah, they're required.
So you have to add those two tables to your primary table first.
Yeah.
All right. And then when you do create the temporal table, it inherits those columns as well. But that hidden option allows you to hide them in the primary table.
Sure. So it doesn't show as standard.
Yeah.
Well,
so if you're plonking columns onto a form, for example, you don't want to see those.
But could those names be different? Could it be valid from and valid to?
Yes, you can change those dates.
Okay.
Ken, could you expand
they're specified here.
Right.
Ken, could you expand the column?
Which column?
I think we lost his sound. I think you muted or something.
Can anyone explain why the period from date and the period to date would be the same, like we saw in that one record? What does it really mean?
Double
I
save
was probably
very
doing
quickly.
something stupid that made an immediate change with.
No.
So you've got that
right at the very front. Yeah, right. The second one.
Notice the system username is different between the second and third record.
Ah, that's what happened. I added a column.
Right.
Hence,
Huh.
there was no change to the data, and it happened in an instant. So there was just a change to well, I changed 2 columns. Yeah. So that's what
Oh, at the same
initiated the
time.
change,
Yeah.
was adding columns rather than changing data. Well spotted.
That wasn't obvious.
Hey, Ken, could
Yep.
you
Thank
could
you.
you expand the column in the tree view for this table, please? The class table. Expand
Can I
the columns
Can you
list
try
on
that
the
again?
tree view on the left.
expand which column?
On the left-hand side in the tree view of the table, can you expand the columns? Yep, that's your temporal and the main one. That one, yeah. There you go. So, yeah. So you see your hidden fields.
Yep.
Yeah, design.
Thank you.
All right. So the point is that they've all got the same fields. Well, both tables have the same fields. It's just that in the temporal table, the class ID is no longer a primary key. It's not a clustered index, but otherwise they've got all the same columns.
Yeah, that does become a bit of a bitch, really, when you've got a unique index, but then you've got different versions of them, which that's not going to change.
Different
So-
versions of.
Well, every time you do the same record, you create a new record in the temporal table with the same ID, same unique reference. Obviously, in that temporal table, it can't be a unique reference.
Well, it's
Yes,
really
but the
it's
primary
really a
key is a
foreign
foreign
key
key
that relates to
in the
that. Yeah.
temporal table.
Yeah.
So two
So that
talking
should-
about that.
It's
So that's, theory. If I was creating audit tables manually, that would be a foreign key that relates to this.
Exactly.
And I would actually put a separate clustered index on my audit table, as you could see where I have done that. Where did I put class audit,
Oh.
right? So see here, I've got, that's a foreign key, and that's got its own clustered index.
I just brought attention to it because it's a little bit unusual to think of something which is a primary index, a unique reference, suddenly not being unique anymore. And
Well,
that's
because it's an audit. Yeah.
That's because you've got various versions of the same record.
So typically what I would do is I would actually have a unique composite index based on the ID and the edit date. But as you can see in the temporal table, if you change the columns, you get a new record. So you've actually got 2 records that have got the same ID and the same edit date because I've changed the data structure. So that ain't going to fly. But when you're building a subform in, say, an access form, where you use the parent-child, your parent record is that ID, and the subform is linked to that same ID in your temporal table, so you can see all the related records to the main form, and you can see all the dates change. So yeah, I hadn't realised before that you actually get a new record in your temporal table when you change the data structure. That's good.
Well, that absolutely makes sense because they're not the same.
May I ask a question, Kent?
Yes, you may, Adrian.
Thank you. You have under your class TBL class audit, you have the class audit _ID. Now, in the other one that we looked at, we had the temporal table. Oh, that is not a temporal table, is it?
No, that's an example of the way I used to create audit tables.
There you go. Thank you. That answers that question.
Yeah, so it has its own clustered primary key, and that's auto incrementing.
Yeah, but
It has a foreign key relationship on that backed up here.
Yeah, what it doesn't have is exactly the same columns as the table that it's replicating, that it's versioning like.
Because I'd actually have to go in and manually do that, or apply the schema changes from using TSQL to here, apart from not putting a primary key on that. But then, I could just go add, so I could use the same SQL to add to this table as I did to add columns to this table, but I didn't because I was busy doing other stuff. But yeah, theoretically, this audit table should have all the same columns as the primary table, but with an additional, its own clustered primary key index.
And that makes it difficult for a temporal table to have a clustered primary index.
Well, it doesn't need one, apparently.
Yeah.
Well, it must have its own, it must have an inbuilt one, I would guess, which would be the reference, the original reference, so in this case your class ID, as well as the period from and period to date. And they would all be moved together to be a primary key that is just not immediately visible because you go through the interface that SQL has prepared for you, which is for system time as of.
Yeah, so it'd be interesting to know what if the temporal table has a clustered index, what is the column that's on?
Would it necessarily have to be clustered index though?
Well, you can only have a clustered index on one column in a table, and it's usually a good idea to have one.
You can only have
it's usually the primary key.
You can expand the indexes and see what's there.
Oh, now you're making sense.
I didn't hear what Brian said.
He wants to see what the indexes are.
The indexes, and there you go.
Yeah, sure.
There you go.
Temperate clustered is, yeah, here we go. I was going to say I would expect it to, it doesn't even have the primary ID. It just has a period to date and period from date. Oh, look, funny order. It is ask, isn't it? Oh, specify. So it is clustered. It can get away without being clustered, but that doesn't necessarily be, sometimes there are benefits from clustering. But yeah. Oh, optimize for sequential key. Interesting.
Yeah, I used to have one of those, but the wheels fell off. So optimize for sequential keys. Yes, that's quite a useful thing sometimes, sequences.
What I notice about that, Kent, is that it doesn't include the primary ID of the table that it's following.
Yes, I was wondering about that. But see, the primary table doesn't necessarily have to have a clustered primary index.
There you go. I'm not necessarily clustered. I don't think clustered is relevant in this.
No.
But certainly, if it doesn't need a primary index, then it's not going to know what to use as a primary index. So yeah, that would make sense.
Because when we're creating the temporal tables, wherever that code was,
we had it somewhere.
Yeah, the temporal table requires those two columns.
Indeed, it does. Yes.
It doesn't require anything else. It's up to you, whatever the hell else you want to put in there.
Yeah, indeed.
Those are the only two columns it knows it has to have.
What about where in there was that not a script you created? Was that a script to say just create the indexes?
Oh yeah, I wrote this from scratch. No, I stole it off the internet.
No, sorry, I meant the previous page, the one you've just moved away from. That one, that script you created just from the yeah, there you go.
I just did a
script create index or something.
Yeah.
Create two, but it created the index rather than the whole table with indexes.
Yeah.
Indices. So that's what. Yeah.
Okay, let's expand constraints as well, just for completeness of the discussion.
Oh.
There are none. Okay.
Not a lot there. There is none.
That was simple. When we get to a good stopping point, we're past our allotted time. So
just the point on that the fact that there are no constraints. Audit tables don't need any constraints because you're copying it from a table that had the constraints. Yeah, so if you defied the constraints in the original table, that would have prevented you. So the audit table or the temporal table doesn't need constraints.
Good point.
Okay, I'm finished. I'm done.
I think what I'll do is check the chat, see if we missed anything. I think we got everything pretty much in the chat.
I
Oh.
did have one question earlier, George.
I'll go up to the top. Why
you
don't
want
you
me to
just go
read it
ahead
out?
and repeat your question, because I will scroll here.
Sure, I've just navigated to it. I was just a clarification thing, really. So automatic addition of matching columns into the temporal table is supported by TSQL. So in other words, if you use TSQL to add an extra column into your table, the temporal table gets that added automatically too, but
Yep.
not yet by SSMS, but the standard interface. So if you go into SSMS and say, like, make this change here, without doing it through SQL, just go in and add a column, it won't add it to the temporal table in that case.
No, because if you've got the temporal table turned on, SQL Management Studio doesn't give you an option to modify. You can't even create an alter script.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
But
So there's no design. There's no design option on the menu here.
But
And
wasn't your
that's-
point before you could turn that off and then script it out and then turn it back on again?
Yeah,
Yeah, that was your point in the presentation, right? Or was I missing something else there?
yeah, yeah. So if you turn it off
script.
and script the you could make the change and script it out. You just have to get it in the right order. So adding columns using TSQL does the business. And that's the way I always do it. Because in my front ends, I have a table that lists all the back-end tables, and I have a table that lists all the columns in them. And I've got VBA that creates TSQL that runs against an ADO connection and updates the back-end schema. So when I put a new version from production into test, that process runs and updates the back-end schema. And if that all works fine, when it goes into production, it does the same thing. And no one is ever having to manually run scripts or hack around in Management Studio or in the back end of the database. And I do the same thing for both Access backends and SQL backends. No one should be hacking around in them unless you're in production. I apply the changes into my front end and away we go. So even with something like that stored procedure, I actually put that script that creates the stored procedure into a table in the front end. And when a new version is detected, it runs those changes and updates everything in SQL Server. So there's never any user intervention because users make mistakes.
Kent, can I take you back to my original question? Because the point of that was about using the SSMS interface compared to TSQL. And your answer used TSQL as an illustration of what the interface did, which is not what I'm really looking for. So yes, we know TSQL does it. And when you use TSQL within SSMS, that does it. But
Yep.
as far as I understand, the interface, as in you go in and make changes to the design by saying edit the table, that doesn't support it. And I assume, and I don't know if you've heard of Azure Data Studio, but it's a 64-bit version of what SSMS is a bit like. It's not an exact copy, but I assume I'm asking you, if you have any experience of that, does it have the same restriction?
No, because it's running TSQL.
No,
So
nothing is running TSQL.
And what you're talking about there, Data Studio, right? It has a really nice interface because it shows you like the this,
Mm-hmm.
and it also shows you the script that it's going to run at the same time. So with Data Studio, you can actually make changes in Management Studio or in Data Studio, and you can synchronize them. But in Data Studio, it's got an interface that looks like this, but it creates TSQL to do it.
So it converts everything it does into T-SQL,
Yep.
and therefore, and thus we can infer that it then has all the benefits. So if you use Azure Data Studio, you get the benefits of doing it in T-SQL, even though you've got the interface as provided by Microsoft.
Exactly.
Thank you.
All
That's
right.
a
So
perfect answer. Thank you.
I did want to touch on one additional thing. Crystal went ahead and put the link and information about the new Discord server, which I appreciate, Crystal, because I forgot to do that. And if you want to get the information out of the chat, you can find that. I believe that is going to be an interesting project. I don't know if Discord is the right tool. It seems very appropriate to set up informal, regular, irregular meetings of people with similar projects or topics that they want to discuss. So with that, I will go ahead and stop the recording.
Well, we'll find out, won't we, George?
Yeah, we'll find out in another week or so.